Before you even finish this sentence, something within you has already decided how far you can go. It wasn't a calculation. It wasn't logic. It was a silent limit that moved within your mind like an ancient reflex. Sigmund Freud spent his life trying to show the world exactly this. Human beings are not governed by consciousness, but by subterranean forces that operate before thought, before choice, before will. And it is in this hidden territory that the true command of your financial life resides. There exists inscribed in your unconscious a number, a maximum value that you accept as possible for yourself. It doesn't appear as a clear phrase, nor as an explicit belief. It manifests as a sensation, as discomfort, as an invisible boundary that, when touched, activates fear, guilt, or immediate rejection. Freud would call this repressed content organized in the form of a symptom. The mind doesn't say, "I can't." It says, "This isn't for me." And this difference is crucial. If right now, effortlessly and without planning, you were to imagine buying a car, what would be the maximum price that spontaneously comes to mind? Notice, the answer comes too quickly to be rational. It emerges ready-made. Freud stated that everything that arises in this way belongs to the unconscious. It's not a choice, it's repetition. It's not a desire, it's permission. This number wasn't created today nor yesterday. It was installed when you didn't yet have the words to question it. The unconscious doesn't operate with arguments, but with symbols. It doesn't understand inflation, markets, opportunities, or potential. It understands security and threat. It understands belonging and exclusion. It understands love and punishment. When you cross an internal boundary, even if that boundary is artificial, the unconscious reacts as if it were protecting your psychic survival. Freud taught us that the mind prefers known pain to the risk of the unknown. It prefers to repeat familiar suffering rather than allow an expansion that disrupts its internal structure. That's why, so often, when money starts coming in, something happens. An unforeseen event, an emergency, a loss, not as external punishment, but as internal reorganization. The unconscious needs to restore the balance to which it has been conditioned, and it does so without asking permission from your consciousness. You call it bad luck. Freud would call it a compulsion to repeat. Perhaps you think this is directly related to how much you earn today, your profession, or your material reality. But the unconscious doesn't work with the present. It operates from the past. It responds to unresolved emotional memories. The adult mind carries intact the childlike logic that learned very early on what was permissible to desire and what needed to be repressed. Money in this context was never just money. It became a symbol of power, separation, judgment, and conditional love. Freud stated that the superego is born from the internalization of authority voices. Parents, family, society. Everything that was heard repeatedly became internal law. When these voices associated money with conflict, guilt, or punishment, the mind learned to defend itself from abundance as if it were a threat. And all unconscious defense acts before reason. You don't analyze the opportunity. You discard it. You don't assess the value. You walk away. Not out of incapacity, but out of unconscious loyalty to a limit that has never been questioned. What's most disturbing is realizing that you might believe you're choosing when in reality you're obeying. Freud said that true freedom begins when what was hidden becomes conscious. Until that happens, the unconscious directs, and consciousness only justifies. That's why ready-made, seemingly rational phrases emerge, serving to mask deep fear. I don't need that much. Money changes people. The important thing is to be simple. These aren't values. They're shields. Honestly observe. How many times have you felt a vague discomfort when thinking about earning more than you earn? Today, not a concrete plan, just the idea. A subtle tension. A feeling that something might be out of place. Freud would see this as the clearest sign that an internal limit is being touched. The unconscious reacts whenever its symbolic structure is threatened, and it reacts quickly, silently, with absolute efficiency. None of this is failure. None of this is a defect. It's psychic functioning. It's the mind trying to maintain coherence with the story it has learned to tell about who you are and the place you can occupy in the world. But every psychic structure can be understood, and everything that can be understood can be transformed. Freud never promised comfort. He promised clarity. And clarity begins when you accept that the greatest obstacle between you and prosperity is not in the external, world, but in the invisible number that governs your inner field. A number that acts as a boundary, as a law, as silent destiny. As long as it remains hidden, you will continue to believe that you are advancing or retreating through conscious choices. When it is revealed, something changes. The repetition begins to lose its power, but revealing is not the same as dissolving. What sustains this number is not a simple idea, but rather a deep architecture of the psyche. And that is precisely where the real journey begins. Throughout your life, you've heard the same story repeated, sometimes directly, sometimes disguised as well-intentioned advice. Work hard, strive more, hang in there. One day the reward will come. This narrative infiltrates daily life so naturally that it is rarely questioned. It appears in family conversations, at work, motivational speeches, on social media, and yet something about it never quite fits. Freud would say that this is precisely where the symptom lies. When an idea is repeated too often but doesn't explain reality, it begins to produce silent anguish. Observe the real world, not the ideal one. Think of that acquaintance who wakes up before sunrise, spends the whole day solving problems, arrives home exhausted, and yet still struggles to make ends meet at the end of the month. Now think of another person, perhaps from the same neighborhood, the same city, with a similar background, who works fewer hours, seems to handle less pressure, and yet lives comfortably, with choices and tranquility. This difference is not an exception. It is too common to be ignored. If effort were the deciding factor, the world would have a predictable logic, but it doesn't. Freud warned us that human beings do not act guided by conscious reason, but by unconscious forces that shape their behavior long before any rational decision. The myth of absolute effort functions as a collective morality that attempts to organize chaos. It promises justice where, in practice, psychic repetition exists. And when reality contradicts this myth, the mind enters into conflict. The question arises that is rarely asked aloud. If I'm doing everything right, why isn't it working? This question is unsettling because it threatens the constructed identity. Admitting that the effort is insufficient touches on something deeper, the idea that perhaps the game isn't played solely on an external level. Freud would call this resistance. The mind resists seeing what dismantles its narrative of control. It's more comfortable to believe that effort is lacking than to accept that there's an internal programming operating behind the scenes. Think about how many times you've promised yourself that by earning a little more, everything would fall into place. That when you reached a certain amount, you would finally feel secure. But when the money increased, the feeling of tranquility didn't come in the same proportion. The worries simply changed form. Freud would explain this by saying that the unconscious doesn't seek comfort, it seeks coherence. It keeps you within the emotional pattern you've learned to recognize as familiar. If scarcity was the dominant psychic environment, the mind finds ways to reproduce it, even when external circumstances change. In everyday life, this appears almost imperceptibly. An opportunity arises, but something inside you tells you to wait a little longer. A project could grow, but you feel the need to prepare better. Study more, postpone it. A raise is possible, but you yourself minimize your value. Avoid asking, accept less than you could. All this seems like prudence. Freud would call it rationalization, the ego creating acceptable explanations for decisions that are actually guided by the unconscious fear of exceeding an internal limit. Society reinforces this process by transforming sacrifice into an absolute virtue. Suffering becomes a sign of character. Resting generates guilt. Prospering awakens distrust. Freud observed that guilt is one of the most effective tools of the superego. When the mind associates money with guilt, it begins to sabotage any movement that threatens to break this link. No matter how hard you work, if prospering triggers internal punishment, the mind will find a way to prevent it. There's a specific moment when this becomes clear to almost everyone, although few recognize it. It's that instant when you realize you're always busy, always tired, always dealing with urgent matters, but you never feel like you're really making progress. The days go by full, but the future seems stagnant. Freud would see this as a neurotic cycle. Much action, little transformation. Psychic energy is spent keeping the system running, not changing it. The unexpected element is realizing that the mind can use effort itself as a form of defense. Overworking can be an unconscious way of avoiding confronting deep-seated beliefs about worthiness and personal value. while you are busy. You don't have to face the emptiness that arises when effort doesn't yield the promised results. The myth of hard work then becomes armor. Protects, but it also imprisons. Perhaps that's why so many people feel a strange discomfort when imagining a life with more financial freedom. It's not immediate joy. It's tension, as if something were out of place. Freud would say that this reaction reveals a conflict between desire and prohibition. The desire to prosper exists, but it clashes with an internal law that dictates how far you can go. When this law is threatened, the mind responds with anxiety. The turning point comes when you begin to suspect that the problem isn't a lack of effort, nor a lack of opportunity, but an unconscious loyalty to an old structure. This doesn't mean that work doesn't matter. It means that it's not the deciding factor. The deciding factor is the inner permission to receive, sustain, and expand. Freud never romanticized the unconscious. He described it as a complex, sometimes cruel, but always logical territory within its own history. If today you repeat financial patterns that don't make rational sense, it's because they make emotional sense. And as long as this logic isn't understood, the myth of hard work will continue to be repeated, even when reality insists on proving otherwise. Perhaps the most uncomfortable question isn't, why don't I earn more? But what is it about me that prevents this from happening? This question doesn't find an immediate answer. It opens a space of silence, and it is in this silence that the unconscious begins to reveal itself. It is there that the narrative begins to change. The unconscious financial ceiling doesn't behave like a common belief, one that can be replaced by a positive affirmation or a new, rational argument. It acts as a deep defense mechanism, a psychic structure that Freud would recognize as organized to preserve the individual's internal stability, even if it costs growth, pleasure, or freedom. The mind doesn't seek prosperity. It seeks emotional predictability, and when abundance threatens to disrupt that predictability, the unconscious reacts with the same force it would to physical danger. This ceiling doesn't appear as an explicit order. It manifests as an invisible limit of tolerance. When you approach it, something within you begins to contract. It's not thought, it's sensation. A slight tightness in the chest, a restlessness without apparent cause, a strange urgency to solve problems that didn't exist before. Freud described this movement as a sign of psychic conflict. Desire advances, the superego reacts, and the ego tries to mediate by creating behaviors that seem logical, but serve only to restore the former equilibrium. That's why so many people don't fail dramatically, but stagnate. They come close to a turning point, but something always prevents the next step. The unconscious doesn't need to destroy, it just needs to delay, confuse, divert. A postponed decision, a sudden fear, an ignored opportunity. The mind creates subtle obstacles because it believes, at some deep level, that surpassing that plateau will bring worse emotional consequences than remaining where it is. Known suffering still seems safer than unknown freedom. Have you ever noticed how, just when something starts to go right, doubts arise that didn't exist before, or problems arise that demand your immediate attention? Freud stated that the unconscious acts as a guardian of old pain. It protects the child you once were, even when the adult you have become no longer needs that protection. If at some point in your history, prospering meant conflict, rejection, or loss of love, the mind learned to associate growth with threat. No matter how much reality changes, the unconscious continues to react as if it were in that original scenario. The financial ceiling in this sense is not an enemy, but a vestige of emotional survival. There's something even more subtle in this process. The ceiling doesn't just define how much you can earn, but how much you can sustain. Many people even manage to achieve higher earnings for a short period, but soon lose, spend, or get involved in situations that dissolve the gain. Freud would call this a return to the point of fixation. The psyche always returns to the place where it feels recognized. If excess generates anxiety or guilt, the unconscious works to eliminate this excess, even if it is done through paths that seem illogical or self-destructive. In everyday life, this manifests itself in seemingly neutral choices. Impulsive spending after an unexpected gain, hasty financial decisions, bad associations made at the wrong time. None of this happens by chance. The unconscious mind doesn't distinguish between money and emotion. It uses money as a language to express internal conflicts. When you exceed your limit, the mind interprets this as a transgression and activates Corrective mechanisms. How many times have you wondered why you can't maintain a higher standard, even when you prove that you are capable of achieving it? The least explored aspect of this financial ceiling is its link to identity. Freud viewed identity as something constructed from primary identifications. You learn who you are by observing those around you. If in your environment, prospering meant not being like us, then growing came to represent alienation, loneliness, or betrayal, the financial ceiling, then, doesn't just limit money, it preserves belonging. The mind prefers to forego resources rather than risk losing the feeling of belonging. This point explains why the financial ceiling often intensifies when someone begins to stand out. The more visible the growth, the greater the internal discomfort. The unconscious doesn't just want material security. It wants coherence with the internal image built throughout life. Prospering too much can mean abandoning old personas, familiar roles, and unspoken promises made in childhood. And the mind resists these ruptures with all the tools it possesses. Freud described repetition as an unconscious attempt to master the original trauma. The person repeats situations not to suffer, but to unconsciously try to control them. In the financial field, this translates into cycles that repeat themselves with slight variations but never break the central pattern. The ceiling remains intact because it has not been recognized as a psychic structure, only as an external circumstance. What if what you call bad luck, hardship, or lack of opportunity is actually a highly organized internal system trying to keep your identity intact? The real suspense lies not in the external world, but in what happens when you begin to see through this mechanism. The simple realization that the ceiling is not destiny, but defense already creates a fissure. Freud believed that consciousness does not immediately eliminate the symptom but weakens its authority. The unconscious loses power when it ceases to operate in the dark. And for the first time, the repetition begins to be questioned. This is a delicate point, because questioning the ceiling doesn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it can generate anxiety, confusion, and a feeling of instability. The mind senses that something fundamental is being touched. But it is precisely in this discomfort that transformation begins to take shape. The unconscious financial ceiling doesn't fall all at once. It cracks, and each crack reveals not only fear, but also repressed desire, contained potential, and possibilities that were never explored. Are you prepared to deal with what arises when the protection that limited you begins to weaken? Freud never promised a comfortable path. He proposed a true path. And the truth in this case is that the financial ceiling is not sustained solely by superficial beliefs, but by a deep architecture of the psyche. Understanding this completely changes the initial question. It's no longer about how to earn more, but about what within me reacts when I think about exceeding certain limits. The answer to this question is not outside. It begins to emerge when you accept looking inward without looking away. There is a specific moment, almost always forgotten, when the financial ceiling ceases to be merely a vague feeling and begins to transform into a structure. Freud called this process the formation of the superego, the I, silent incorporation of external voices that, over time, cease to be perceived as external. They become internal law. It is no longer someone telling you what you can or cannot do. It is you yourself policing yourself, limiting yourself, correcting yourself before any real risk exists. Imagine a child sitting at the table while adults discuss bills. There's no direct aggression, no explicit threat, but there's tension in the air, long sighs, uncomfortable silences, worried glances. The child's unconscious registers everything. Freud observed that children don't understand numbers, but they understand emotions. They associate money with anxiety, instability, and conflict. Years later, that same person might rationally claim they want to prosper, but their body reacts as if facing an old danger. The financial ceiling begins there not as an idea, but as an emotional memory. There is some interesting data that illustrates this. Studies in behavioral psychology show that children, repeatedly exposed to scarcity discourse, tend, in adulthood, to exhibit a greater aversion to financial risk, even when they have the objective means to invest or grow. Interestingly, this aversion doesn't manifest as conscious fear. It appears as excessive prudence, as a constant need for control, as an inability to seize opportunities that require a leap. Freud would say that the superego acts disguised as common sense. This process isn't limited to the family. The school reinforces it. The teacher praises obedience but punishes boldness. The system rewards those who fit in, not those who question. Gradually, the mind learns that security is linked to conformity. Prosperity becomes associated with standing out, and standing out with risking rejection. The financial ceiling isn't just economic, it's social. It defines how far you can go without breaking with the group you've learned to belong to. There are accounts of people who, upon beginning to earn more than their parents ever did, felt intense, almost paralyzing guilt. Not because someone accused them, but because something inside them told them they were betraying a legacy. Freud would explain this as unconscious loyalty. The psyche maintains invisible ties with important figures from the past. If prospering symbolically means being greater than those who came before, the superego reacts, attempting to restore the internal hierarchy learned in childhood. Religion and culture amplify this mechanism. In many traditions, wealth has been associated with sin, vanity, or moral corruption. Even when a person no longer consciously follows these beliefs, the symbols remain active in the unconscious. Freud extensively studied the power of internalized moral symbols. They don't need to be true to be effective. It is enough that they have been repeated with sufficient emotional charge. The result is a mind that associates money with punishment, even without realizing it. An unlikely but common occurrence in therapy sessions illustrates this well. People who win the lottery or receive unexpected inheritances frequently exhibit self-sabotaging behaviors. Soon after the gain, not due to a lack of intelligence, but due to psychic disorganization, the money arrives before the mind is prepared to sustain it. Freud would call this an invasion of desire without elaboration. The superego temporarily collapses, and the ego tries to restore balance in disordered ways. The financial ceiling, when not respected, reacts strongly. What's most intriguing is realizing how the environment continues to reinforce this ceiling throughout adulthood. Seemingly harmless comments, such as "that's not for people like us" or "whoever has too much always loses," are absorbed without resistance. Freud observed that the unconscious is highly suggestible when the information comes from figures with effective value, friends, partners, work colleagues. The social circle functions as a mirror that confirms or corrects the size of your ceiling. If everyone around lives within the same limit, exceeding it generates collective discomfort, even if no one says so explicitly. There is also the curious phenomenon of self-exclusion. People stop frequenting certain environments, applying for certain opportunities, or associating with certain groups not because they are rejected, but because they feel out of place. Freud would see this as the workings of the financial superego, an internal force that defines where you belong to being. The ceiling manifests itself as a feeling of not belonging. Even before any real attempt at inclusion, this process creates a powerful illusion that your opinions about money are entirely your own. The person believes they don't want more, that they prefer a simple life, that they don't care about status or comfort. In some cases, this may be true. In many others, it's just the voice of the superego speaking in its own tone. Freud warned that the mind is an expert at deceiving itself. To avoid internal conflicts, the financial ceiling is thus maintained not by force, but by naturalization. When you begin to observe this mechanism in action, something strange happens. Certain phrases begin to sound empty. Certain certainties lose their solidity. You realize that many of your choices weren't exactly choices, but automatic responses to an internal system that sought to preserve belonging, approval, and emotional security. This recognition doesn't bring immediate euphoria. It brings silence, a silence laden with questions. And perhaps the most disconcerting of these is this: how many decisions in your financial life were truly your own, and how many were merely obedience to a psychic architecture, built long before you were aware of it? When this question arises, the financial ceiling begins to be seen not as destiny, but as a construction, and everything that has been built, even slowly, can be questioned. The narrative doesn't end here. It only deepens. There comes a point when the financial ceiling stops seeming distant, almost theoretical, and begins to reveal itself in everyday life in a disconcerting way. Freud said that the unconscious manifests itself not in what we think, but in what we do repeatedly without realizing it. This is where the silent saboteurs come in. They don't shout, they don't warn, they don't appear as obvious mistakes. They infiltrate daily behavior, small choices, automatic responses that seem too natural to be questioned. It all begins with two questions your mind asks whenever an opportunity arises. They are quick, almost imperceptible. The first is, am I capable of sustaining this? The second, do I deserve this? These questions are not formulated in words. They appear as sensations, a tightness in the stomach, a sudden doubt, an impulse to retreat. Freud stated that when the unconscious answer to either of them is negative, the ego kicks in to avoid conflict. And it does so by sabotaging, but in an elegant, rationalized, acceptable way. The first sign is usually difficulty in receiving. A compliment is minimized. Gift is refused. Recognition generates discomfort. It seems like humility, but it's fear. Receiving implies accepting value, and accepting value requires confronting the unconscious belief of unworthiness. Freud saw this behavior as an expression of internalized guilt. The mind rejects what is good to maintain consistency with the image it has learned to hold of itself. Every time you refuse something positive, you silently reinforce that image. Soon after, the belief arises that there's never enough money. No matter how much comes in, there's always something that consumes it all. Bills pile up, unexpected expenses accumulate, and financial decisions are made without planning. The person believes this is simply reality, but Freud would observe the pattern. The mind doesn't allow accumulation because excess generates anxiety. Saving money is symbolic. It signifies security, choice, autonomy. For those who have learned that security doesn't exist or that autonomy brings punishment, the unconscious reacts by creating constant leaks. There are also energy vampires, who are rarely seen as saboteurs at first glance. They are people close to you, often loved ones, who reinforce doubts, fears, and comparisons. Freud would explain this through the mechanism of projective identification. The other person expresses aloud what your unconscious already fears. You listen, agree, absorb, and little by little you begin to doubt your own steps. The most unsettling thing is realizing that in many cases, the energy vampires yourself, internally repeating criticisms, complaints, and comparisons that drain your own psychic energy. Next comes the financial thermometer, perhaps the most intriguing saboteur. Whenever you start to move forward, something happens to pull you back. An unexpected expense, an urgent problem, a poorly calculated decision. Freud would call this a compulsion to repeat. The unconscious recreates situations to restore the learned level of emotional comfort. It's not external punishment. It's internal self-regulation. Money acts as a trigger for old conflicts, and the psychic system reacts by trying to normalize what it considers excessive. But the most profound twist appears in imposter syndrome. Even when everything seems to be going well, the feeling of fraud arises. Constant fear of being discovered, of losing everything, of not being able to maintain the position achieved. Freud saw this phenomenon as a result of a severe superego, which demands perfection and punishes any deviation. The person begins to hide to avoid visibility, to charge less than they are worth. Prospering becomes dangerous because it increases exposure. And exposure for the unconscious has always been risk. These saboteurs don't act in isolation. They combine, alternate, and reinforce each other. At times you feel you're making progress. At others, it seems like everything is crumbling without a clear explanation. What keeps this cycle active is the emotional core that sustains the two pillars, ability and worthiness. Freud stated that unresolved emotional wounds continue to operate in adults with the same intensity as they did in children. Time doesn't heal what hasn't been understood. If you grew up hearing that you weren't smart enough, your self-perception has been damaged. If you saw important people struggle and not prosper, your worthiness has been questioned. If you experienced humiliation, rejection, or constant comparisons, both pillars have been weakened. And the unconscious, to protect you from this old pain, prefers to keep you within known limits. The financial ceiling then becomes a disguised comfort zone. Here arises a crucial moment in the narrative. Most people, upon recognizing these patterns, try to combat them with willpower. They promise to change habits, think positively, and work harder. Freud would warn that this rarely works. The unconscious does not respond to orders. It responds to understanding. As long as the wounds remain active, the saboteurs will continue to find new ways to act. The ego may even win a specific battle, but it loses the war in the long run. The point of tension lies precisely here. Recognizing the saboteurs is uncomfortable because it dismantles the idea that you've always been in control. But it's also liberating. because it reveals that the problem isn't real incapacity, nor a lack of opportunities. It's an internal system that can be reconfigured. Freud said that making the unconscious conscious doesn't eliminate the conflict immediately, but it changes its nature. What previously ruled in the dark becomes observable. The question that almost inevitably begins to form is unsettling. If these saboteurs have been driving so many decisions in your financial life, what happens when you learn to recognize them the moment they arise? This question doesn't bring an immediate answer. It creates expectation, it creates silence, and it prepares the ground for something even deeper. Because identifying the problem is only the beginning. True transformation begins when you understand what sustains these saboteurs and how to dissolve the emotional root that feeds them. There comes a point when understanding is no longer enough. Freud stated that insight is only the beginning of the therapeutic process, never the end. Understanding the unconscious financial ceiling, recognizing the saboteurs, perceiving the influence of the past and emotional wounds, changes how you look at your own history. But it doesn't transform reality on its own. Transformation begins when this understanding finds conscious, repeated, sustained action. It is here that the journey ceases to be intellectual and becomes existential. If you've made it this far, something within you has already shifted. Perhaps not clearly, perhaps still shrouded in doubt, but there has been a shift. The unconscious reacts when observed, defends itself, but it also reveals itself. Freud said that what has been brought to consciousness loses some of its compulsive power. This means that from this point on, you can no longer say you didn't know, and that is a silent but powerful responsibility. The practical path begins with something simple yet profound, observing yourself without judgment. Whenever an opportunity arises, whenever you think about earning more, charging more, investing in yourself, or expanding, stop for a moment and observe your internal reaction. Don't try to correct it immediately. Don't fight it. Just notice. Notice the discomfort, the urge to retreat, the desire to postpone, the subtle guilt. This moment of observation is already an act of rupture. It is the conscious ego looking at an old pattern without automatically obeying it. Next, it's necessary to ask new questions. Not the usual questions like, will this work out? Or what if I lose? But questions that touch the root. What exactly do I fear? Losing if I prosper? Who do I believe I can distance myself from? What image of myself could be threatened? Freud saw in these questions the beginning of psychic elaboration. They create space for desire and fear to coexist without one, canceling out the other. Another essential step is to review your relationship with deserving, not as an abstract concept but as a daily practice. Receiving without justifying, accepting compliments without minimizing them, saving money, even a small amount, as a symbolic gesture of commitment to yourself. These acts seem small, but to the unconscious they are clear signs of reprogramming. They say, I can sustain something different. I can occupy more space. I can exist without guilt. It's important to understand that discomfort doesn't disappear immediately. Freud never promised quick relief. He spoke of a process. When you cross the unconscious financial threshold, you enter new territory where old defenses no longer work. But new structures are not yet consolidated. It's normal to feel insecure, afraid, even wanting to go back. This doesn't mean failure. It means transition. Seeking support is also part of the journey. Therapy, study groups, mentoring, reading, reflective writing. The unconscious reorganizes itself better when it is not isolated. Freud defended the importance of relationships for psychic transformation. No one elaborates alone what was built in relation to others. Choosing environments, content, and people that support its expansion is a practical and profoundly strategic decision. Perhaps the most delicate point is accepting that thriving isn't just about making money. It's about sustaining a new identity. It's about allowing yourself to be seen differently. It's about abandoning old narratives that, although limiting, were familiar. The unconscious financial ceiling falls when you stop identifying with the story it protects. When you understand that honoring your origins doesn't require repeating your limitations. When you realize that growing up isn't about betraying anyone but about taking responsibility for your own life. Freud believed that true freedom is not about doing everything one desires, but about not being governed by what one does not. Understand, financial freedom in this sense is not an end in itself. It is a means to live with more choice, more time, more presence. a means to reduce the anxiety that consumes psychic energy and hinders human development. When money ceases to be a constant source of fear, it becomes merely a tool, and the mind can finally dedicate itself to what truly matters. If this content resonated with you, don't ignore it. Write it down. Reflect on it. Observe your patterns in the coming days. Allow yourself to act a little differently, even if you're afraid. Transformation doesn't happen in one grand, heroic gesture, but in the conscious repetition of small changes. That's how the unconscious learns something new. If this video resonated with you, please like it now. This simple gesture helps the content reach more people who also need to hear it. If you'd like, leave a comment telling us what impacted you the most, or share a reflection. You can do so anonymously if you prefer. Your experience could be a turning point for someone who is exactly where you were. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of awareness, depth, and transformation. We're in this together.